sociologist and the anthropologist writing. It is that there is a much difference between the two. Not only that, but even the English department is so badly infiltrated by this sociologist and this almost cryptic philosophical language. This has been such a respite, and for this, I have do huge respect for Alan because he's somebody who is really bearing the flag of literature at this moment when it comes to publishing in university presses. Because I don't see, for instance, Duke. I mean, if there is a book like this sent to Duke, or a literature book that I'm writing at this moment to Duke, Duke said, sorry, we don't have any space for that. It has to be race studies, it has to be ethnic studies, it has to be something, area studies, and only then probably they start to get interested. But I think there is this much of Alan is doing a great job, and you are doing a fantastic job, really, to bring back literature so that people still start to connect with literature in their own way. Something that we have not been doing of late. Um, uh, this is probably my first reaction when I was reading a book and trying to see Keats in from today's times and how you connect Keats to your personal vocabulary and your personal evolution as a person. So that was very fantastic, believe me. I feel I take a lot of heart out of that.
Oh, well, that makes me so happy. Thank you for saying all of that. Yeah, I mean, this is a discussion that we should have, or we can have it twice. We could have it now, and then we could have it
Yeah, we're going to have that. We're going to have this. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the
in the
first.
Q&A. Yeah, because I
Yeah.
think it's such an interesting question. I mean, so much of that, what you say about your experience trying to publish a book mainly about literature that's sort of emphatically literary is so disheartening to me. I think that it comes, of course, from a scarcity model within the publishing industry, that only a few books can be published because academic publishing really is not a for-profit business. And so there are, publishing houses are often in the red, and they need to essentially publish as few books as possible. But
Yeah.
what that means is that, of course, like anything that happens on the free market, certain things get pushed out of the conversation. And it's just so unfortunate because there should be room for everyone to write as everyone wants. I mean, that's sort of my feeling about it. And
Right.
when I was writing this book, I was very much immersed, just as you say, in an extremely literary, but also very personal language, because the book is based on a series of personal experiences, both within and then kind of around the English literary canon, not just English, actually.
Yeah.
So yeah, but that's sad about Duke.
Yeah. It's true. It's very true. And I understand. I mean, you have to one. The publishing houses are really under stress at this moment, and
Sure.
the COVID has really overstretched things at this moment for them.
Oh
So
yeah.
difficult. It gets difficult. Yes, Pradipto, is everything okay now? Can we start?
Ranjanda, I think there's some problem with the live. So I think we can go for the recording and we can start. That
Yeah,
will be
the life can come later. Life can come later. Yes.
So just wait. I'll start the recording fresh.
Yeah, please do. Please begin this. I mean, this.
Otherwise,
I think we are all getting late, so we have to begin. And, yeah.
just wait. And the recording.
Can I suggest something?
Yeah, please.
The recording
Uh,
started. Recording
Can
started.
can we send the link to at least the research scholars from the department,
Yeah, please do.
just,
Pradipto.
just so that
I'll
more
send-
people could
I'll
join
send
in?
Yes, Pradipto, please send the link to all possible people.
Yeah, I'll send it. The recording has started. You start the program.
Okay.
Okay, I'll send. Meanwhile, I'll send it.
So we begin this, and it's a great pleasure to have Professor Anahid Nersessian with us, and we welcome all of you to the fifth Boy Lecture Series, which is actually a very unique platform where we invite a very distinguished speaker to talk about a book that is a boy, and preferably published, of course, in the last 5 years, that we think is remarkable and has all the potential to make an impact, or a book that has made an impact already. So it's been a very successful series, Boy Distinguished Lecture Series, with tremendous support from viewers, from participants, from students, scholars, friends, faculty. So it had made a very glorious start with Catherine Malabou, then followed by Mitchell, W.J.T. Mitchell, then Marjorie Parloff, and Hans Saucy very recently. And of course, there was a bit of a stutter in between where we had this cataclysmic COVID second wave where we really had to suspend things. But we are back on track and solidly on road. So our fifth Boy Distinguished Lecture Series speaker here tonight is Professor Anahid Nersessian, and she is professor at the Department of English at UCLA. Her first book was Utopia Limited, Romanticism and Adjustments, brought out at Harvard University Press in 2015, which is about the formal and political practices of renunciation or self-contentment. Then her second monograph came out called The Calamity Form on Poetry and Social Life, something I really wanted her to speak on as well, because I love this book. So it's from Chicago 2020, Chicago University of Chicago Press, where she takes up this figurative perspectives on the economic ecological crisis. That is something I was really interested in. Also, most importantly, she is the co-founder and the co-editor of an imprint called The Thinking Literature, which is also published by University of Chicago Press. And the boy in focus tonight is called the Keats' Odes, A Lover's Discourse. Now, it's a short book of experimental criticism. We would like to know from Anahid what exactly she means by experimental criticism, which is actually aimed at very general readers. And it builds on her work as a scholar of poetry. The Romantic period, of course, she has worked extensively on the Romantic period, and of course on the history of literary criticism. So with that note, I leave the stage over to Professor Nersessian to take over and show us a very different world that we want to enter with Keats. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ranjan. That was such a really beautiful introduction. I'm so grateful to you for organizing this and to everybody else for being here, especially because I know it's quite late at night where you are. I personally fall asleep around 8:15 now, so I respect anyone who can make it to 9. What I'm going to do today is read a little bit from 2 sections of the book. This is a book, Keats' Odes, A Lover's Discourse, came out in February of this past year in time to coincide with the bicentennial of John Keats' death. John Keats died in February of 1821. And the book is organized as a series of essays around Keats's great odes. So the great odes were 6 poems written all pretty much in 1819, 2 years before Keats's death, in a sort of flurry of creative activity that probably has very few rivals, at least in the history of English literature. People often talk also about Percy Shelley, Keats's contemporary, as having an Annus Mirabilis in 1819. He also produced a number of his most celebrated poems in that year. But Keats's great odes have this somewhat legendary status. And so I decided to organize the book with 1 chapter, 1 essay per ode. And then there's an introduction to the book. There is a very, very short preface, and then there's a very, very short epilogue or postscript. So the 3 middle chapters of the book are a kind of elliptical memoir, and those are not the chapters I'm going to read from today. Rather, I'm going to concentrate on the introduction because it gives you a sense, I think, of the book's method and where the book positions itself in relation to existing conversations around Keats and existing conversations about other matters as well. And then I'm going to flip to the last chapter of the book, which I think I might manage to read in its entirety. I'm going to do my best. It's not very long. And the last chapter is about Keats's poem To Autumn, which is the only one of the great odes that does not have the word ode in its title. So, the other ones, Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode to a Nightingale, Ode to Psyche. To Autumn stands somewhat apart from those poems and also appears to have been the last of the odes that Keats wrote. So I'll read a little bit from the introduction and maybe I'll say something about it, and then I'll switch to Autumn and take you through that essay, and then we can talk as much as we want or as much as we have time for. I really love the talking part of these things. I like the conversation part, so hopefully we'll have lots of space to do that. Okay, so just a little bit from the introduction. Not such a little bit, a medium-sized chunk of the introduction. John Keats was born on October 31st, 1795, and he died of tuberculosis on February 23rd, 1821, aged 25. In that narrow patch of existence, he composed some of the most unrepentingly alive poems in the English language. It is possible that, had he survived, he would have written no more. Quitting had always been an option, and he needed real money to support himself and his fiancée, Fanny Braun. It is also possible that he would have kept writing, and possible too that he would have burrowed even deeper into the broken heart of his century, which, he knew, was reordering time and space in answer to the demands of a new and rapacious economic system. George Bernard Shaw saw in Keats the makings of a full-blooded modern revolutionist, and if he didn't reach the barricades, he did belong on them, because there was nothing Keats loved more than us, those who know this is not all we are meant to be. His poetry is a record of that love and its wild, inconvenient expression. It is a lover's discourse, at once compassionate, exacting, indecent, and pure. This book collects 6 of Keats's poems, known together as the Great Odes. I follow each ode with a short essay that is both critical and autobiographical, although the autobiographical dimension will not always be obvious. In that sense, the essays work like the odes. Odes, roughly speaking, are poems meant to celebrate something or someone, but because they are written from a place of emotional excess or ferment, it's easy for them to tip over into more private preoccupations. Thus, Percy Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, which connects the cycle of the seasons to the here today, gone tomorrow movement of revolutionary struggle, also erupts into the furiously personal cri de coeur, I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. In writing about Keats's odes, I have tried to prop myself open to this same uneven traffic of literary and intimate concerns. This book, then, is a love story between me and Keats, and not just Keats. Keats himself was famously lovable, despite having been born, he said, into an unpromising morning. That sense of bleakness, of having failed before he had begun, dogged him. He was poor, he was short, 6 inches below average, and in ill health. Once he began publishing, his work was almost universally panned. He was temperamental, obsessive, and thin-skinned, and his childhood, which was traumatic, left him nervous, morbid, in the words of his brother George. All the same, he amassed a small army of devoted friends, one of whom called him the most lovable associate that ever lived in the tide of time. Of his death, or perhaps their relationship, Braun wrote, I have not got over it, and never shall. When I say this book is a love story, I mean it is about things that cannot be gotten over, like this world and some of the people in it. The word that gets used most often in conjunction with Keats is sensuous. He is fascinated by how things feel and by the capacity of metaphor to register the dizzying strangeness of being a body among others. Only Keats could come up with the thrilling liquidity of dewy piping or a breathless honey feel of bliss, and not always to his credit. The early poetry, like the soupy epic Endymion, expels an unfortunate phrase every couple of lines. Well-wooing sun, night-swollen mushrooms, fire-tailed exhalations, and so on. This kind of writing disgusted contemporary reviewers who called it puerile and effeminate, healthy and unhealthy and unclean. In Wordsworth, one sniffed, there is no such unhealthy lusciousness. Lord Byron agreed. Such poetry, he declared, is a sort of mental masturbation, and elsewhere he snickers about Johnny Keats's piss-a-bed poetry. A century later, William Butler Yeats slides into the same vein. I see a schoolboy when I think of him with face and nose pressed to a sweet shop window, for certainly he sank into his grave, his senses and his heart unsatisfied, and made, being poor, ailing, and ignorant, shut out from all the luxury of the world, the coarse-bred son of a livery stable keeper, luxuriant song. Yeats makes explicit what Byron doesn't have to. Not only is Keats's poetry sexually deviant, its indecency or luxuriance is amplified by his lower middle-class status. The Romantic period had a taste for so-called peasant poets like Stephen Duck, Anne Yearsley, and John Clare, but Keats was not a peasant. Worse, he skimmed the proletarian perimeter while being aspirationally shabby genteel, a fanciful dreaming tea drinker with a false claim on respectability. In the alchemy of 19th century social prejudice, this rendered him at once oversexed and insufficiently masculine. He was an outcast and a striver and out of genital control, frigging his imagination, Byron again, instead of a nice warm body. It's a singularly nasty assessment, and it sticks. It sticks in part because when he died, Keats's friends played up elements of this picture, and the Victorian era, which Keats missed by just 9 years, ate it up. He was a special favorite of the pre-Raphaelites who mined his work for inspiration. In their poems and canvases, colorless young men repine in the arms of no-good women with hair like candy floss. He became then what he still is to many people now, an escapist rolling around in visions of fairies and butterflies, deliriously aroused but somehow still chaste. In the big box bookstores of my youth, you could always find cheap editions of his poems, squat volumes with gold paint sprayed along their edges. The checkout line held stacks of blank notebooks with Frank Dixie's 1901 painting La Belle Dame sans Merci spilled across the front, and Keats's more notable quotables, I am certain of nothing but of the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of the imagination, printed in the margins. The poetry, it seemed, was safe, commercial, decorative. Above all, it was apolitical. This would have stuck painfully in Keats's craw. The reason he got so much negative attention in the press is because he hung out with well-known radicals and was a radical himself. When one reviewer dubbed Keats and his friends the Cockney School of Poetry, he didn't just mean that they were, as the Brits say, NOCD, not our class, dear. He meant that they were left-wingers, even revolutionaries. This is a view of Keats most academics now share, thanks in large measure to the legendary Walter Jackson Bates, who went from bussing tables in campus dining halls to Harvard professor, whose 1963 biography turned Yeats's picture of the schoolboy Randy for candy on its head. Bates's Keats was a bruiser, his Jacobin sympathies hung in plain sight. Today, if you suggest to a room full of Keats scholars that their man is apolitical, you might be asked to step outside. The trouble with this view of Keats is that it rests heavily on his biography and not much, if at all, on his poetry. Although that poetry was written in dark times, in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars and in the middle of the catastrophic economic downturn they engendered, during the breakneck acceleration of the Industrial Revolution, with its unspeakable dependence on human slavery in the Caribbean and elsewhere, in the wake of the Peterloo Massacre, when armed cavalry maimed or killed a still unknown number of peaceful protesters, it says close to nothing about them. Keats's radicalism lies elsewhere in his style. It is true that Keats is essentialist, that he is obsessed with capturing the heady particularities of taste and touch. It is also true that these tendencies can make his work seem anti-intellectual and even immoral, a gaudy retreat from the world's horrors. He did once claim that with a great poet, the sense of beauty overcomes every other consideration, or rather obliterates all consideration. And according to his friend, Benjamin Robert Hayden, once covered his tongue and throat as far as he could reach with cayenne pepper in order to appreciate the delicious coldness of claret in all its glory. In 1880, Matthew Arnold raised these points by way of complaining about Keats's sensuous strain, and also by way of complaining about his fans, admirers whose pawing and fondness does not good but harm to the fame of Keats by concentrating attention upon what in him is least wholesome and most questionable. He is thinking of lines like these: light feet, dark violet eyes, and parted hair, soft dimpled hands, white neck, and creamy breast are things on which the dazzled senses rest till the fond fixed eyes forget they stare. Arnold was more right than he knew. Keats's senses always strain, are always under stress. Dazzled does not just mean impressed but stricken, brought low, obliterated by beauty as by a blow to the head. It chimes with both fond and fixed, since the former means loving to the point of stupidity, and the latter sounds a syllable out of crucifixion. This is desire as duress, embodiment as ordeal. The person who's really onto him is Shaw, who makes the surprising suggestion that passages of Keats would not be out of place in Das Kapital, and that Karl Marx, had he written poetry, would have written it like Keats. In Isabella or the Pod of Basil, Keats anticipates Marx's claim that industrial production requires an especially brutal expenditure of human brain, nerves, muscles, and sense organs. And the poem, much like Das Kapital, is downright ghoulish. The action revolves around a severed head. Keats's poetry is chock full of viscera, and if his grislier images owe much to his stint as a medical student, they are also signs that Keats grasped something deep about capital's cannibal logic. For every set of soft dimpled hands, there are weary ones that swelt in tortured mines and noisy factories, and for every creamy breast, many once proud quivered loins melting in blood from stinging whip. Early on, Marx decided that the forming of the five senses is a labor of the entire history of the world down to the present. Any attempt to understand the way things are had to be rigorously carnal. It could not operate solely within the orbit of thought, devoid of eyes, of teeth, of everything. Note the allusion to Jake's All the World's a Stage speech in As You Like It, where old age is the state of being sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. Keats had the same idea. His poetry concentrates on the effortful, even agonizing work of shaping the body's response to the world. He loved the lines from Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis that describe the goddess recoiling from the sight of her dead lover like a snail whose tender horns being hit shrinks backward in his shelly cave with pain, eventually drafting them to describe the innumerable compositions and decompositions which take place between the intellect and its thousand materials before it arrives at that trembling, delicate, and snail-horn perception of beauty. To perceive is to hurt, sometimes a little, sometimes a lot. If the task of Marx's critique of political economy is to locate the cause of that pain, the task of Keats's poetry is to make it unforgettable. Okay, so I'm going to now read, again, in its entirety, the last chapter of the book. It's not very long, and it's on Keats's poem To Autumn. I was going to say a few things about the introduction, but maybe I'll actually save them and we can talk about them at the end, or I'll say a few words at the end. So this is the part where you just get to be read to, so everyone can kick back and relax and enjoy the sound of Keats's poetry. There's another poem that is interspersed throughout this chapter. It's not discussed explicitly until the very end of the chapter, and that is one of Diane de Prima's revolutionary letters. So you'll hear first Keats's To Autumn, and then you'll hear a snippet of Diane de Prima's poem, and then you'll hear my prose, and then every now and then you'll hear Diane de Prima's poem again. So the poem is threaded through the chapter. To Autumn. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has o'erbrimmed their clammy cells. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swath and all its twined flowers. And sometimes, like a gleaner, thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press with patient look, thou watchest the last oozings hours by hours. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them, thou hast thy music too, while barred clouds bloom the soft dying day, and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue. Then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn among the river sallows, borne aloft or sinking as the light wind lives or dies, and full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne. Hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. There are those who can tell you how to make Molotov cocktails, flamethrowers, bombs, whatever you might be needing. Find them and learn. Define your aim clearly. Choose your ammo with that in mind. To Autumn is perfect and unforgivable. It is the most definitively dated of all the odes, written on September 19th, 1819. We know this because Keats told a friend about the circumstances of its composition, which took place during a writing retreat in Winchester. How beautiful the season is now, how fine the air, a temperate sharpness about it. Really, without joking, chaste weather, Diane skies. I never liked stubble fields so much as now. I, better than the chilly green of the spring. Somehow, a stubble field looks warm in the same way that some pictures look warm. This struck me so much in my Sunday's walk that I composed upon it. So much of the poem is here, down to the exclamatory I that ushers in a comparison between autumn and spring, in which autumn comes out on top. Chaste is a funny word to use, and Keats knows it. He says he's not joking, but then he immediately makes a joke, calling the sky Diane after Diana, the virgin goddess of the hunt, his nerdiness compulsive and droll as always. Diana will reappear in the ode, dropped down from heaven to earth and shimmied into the ungendered figure of autumn itself, her chastity recast as a more Keatsian voluptuousness that is also, and this is Keatsian too, filmier and faint. Why unforgivable? As he sat tucked up in Winchester, Keats read a horrific report in the papers. Just 4 weeks earlier, on August 16th, a crowd of between 60 and 80,000 people had assembled for a peaceful demonstration at St. Peter's Field, Manchester. A number of activists, including the political celebrity Henry Hunt, were slated to speak. The local magistrates had put together a large security force that included the Manchester and Salford Yeomanry, a volunteer regiment of landowners and merchants with its origins in wartime militia movements. Since 1817, in response to a series of riots, the yeomanry had taken up the cause of suppressing unrest among Manchester's working class, hard hit by the economic depression that followed the Napoleonic Wars. Around 1:30 p.m., the magistrates decided to have Hunt arrested. As the regiments rode in, a mounted trooper struck Anne Filders with his horse so hard that her 2-year-old son, William, whom she was carrying in her arms, flew 2.5 yards out in front of her and broke his head open on the street. William Filders was the first casualty of what would come to be known as the Peterloo Massacre. By 1:35 p.m., the cavalry had charged into the crowd, sabers drawn and slashing indiscriminately. People ran for the walls enclosing the field, and so many fell and were trampled that their bodies quickly piled up into large heaps. In his memoir, Passages in the Life of a Radical, Samuel Bamford would recall a trigger-happy cavalry cutting through naked, held-up hands and defenseless heads, dashing whenever there was an opening, pressing and wounding, and a terrified crowd screaming, "Break, break, they are killing them" in front, and they cannot get away. Separated in the crush from her husband, Jemima Bamford ducked into the cellar of a nearby residence, where she could hear both the cries of the multitude and the family upstairs, bewailing most pitifully as they reacted to what was happening outside. They could see all the dreadful work through the window, and their exclamations were so distressing that I put my fingers in my ears to prevent my hearing more. And on removing them, I understood that a young man had just been brought past, wounded. The front door of the passage before mentioned soon after opened, and a number of men entered carrying the body of a decent middle-aged woman who had been killed. I thought they were going to put her beside me and was about to scream, but they took her forward and deposited her in some premises at the back of the house. By 1:45 p.m., there were, by official count, 650 wounded and 15 dead. The latter category includes John Ashton, who had been carrying the flag of his trade union, 17-year-old William Bradshaw, shot by a musket, brothers William and Edmund Dawson, and Mary Hayes, a pregnant mother of 6, who was trampled so severely that she had seizures right up until she delivered her baby 2 months early and died just before Christmas. You will hear by the papers of the proceedings at Manchester, Keats writes to his brother on September 18th, the day before he would compose his ode. No more is said, and several paragraphs later, he makes an unfortunate crack about having struck for wages like the Manchester weavers to drive up the price of his puns. It's true that just before his remark about Peterloo, Keats has been going on at length about the political climate, noting that the unlucky termination of the French Revolution had allowed the British state to spread a horrid superstition against all innovation and improvement, and thus to undermine our freedom. It's also true, and this is important, that he defined the present struggle in England of the people as the destruction of that superstition and the insistence on moving forward at all costs. When he mentions Peterloo, however, it is to explain why he thinks the state won't prosecute a radical publisher named Richard Carlile for sedition, despite the fact that since the 1790s, a succession of Tory governments had more or less declared open war on the free press. Just look, Keats says, how much the people love Henry Hunt, whose return to London from Manchester was greeted by some 30,000 well-wishers. In short, Peterloo does not appear to have stopped Keats's world on its axis. He seems to have been fairly unusual in that regard. At the time, even nonpartisan newspapers reflected a deeply felt astonishment that Englishmen would kill their own unarmed people, while conservative and left-leaning journalists alike trumpeted Peterloo as the loudest, if not the first shot in an intensifying class war. This is exactly how it appeared to Percy Bysshe Shelley, whose incendiary ballad, The Mask of Anarchy, is often invoked as the anti-to Autumn and used to put it to shame. Shelley's poem advertises itself as a prophetic dream or vision in which Shelley, who was living in Italy, sees the events of Peterloo unfold as a masque, a pantomime or play. The anthropomorphic figures of murder, fraud, hypocrisy, and of course anarchy, which in Shelley's usage means lawless or illegitimate government and not the absence of government altogether, ride by in a diabolical parade. Soon, on anarchy's orders, his troops begin to attack the crowd, which is made up of those who ply the loom and plow and sword and spade, which is to say, the working class. But then Hope appears, a maniac maid who, somewhat shockingly, enjoins the crowd to nonviolent resistance. Let them ride among you there, slash and stab and maim and hew, what they like, that let them do. Her argument is simple, and she makes a simple promise. That slaughter to the nation shall steam up like inspiration, eloquent, oracular, a volcano heard afar. The death and maiming of the innocent, in other words, will make a big impression on those who remain alive, and they in turn will rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number. The poem concludes with what has become its best known line. Ye are many, they are few. The Mask of Anarchy is a messy, spectacular performance, all the more powerful for its glitches, its erratic meter and punctuation, its lurid images, its gonzo cast of real and allegorical characters, which announce with total conviction the necessity of subordinating conventional ideas of poetic beauty to something even more beautiful and even more necessary, in a word, revolution. Slapped down next to it, Keats's ode cuts an awkward, if not outright hideous figure, so intrusively lovely 34 days out from a high-profile human disaster. It is perfect, which means it needs nothing. The Mask of Anarchy, with its angry, insistent address, dares to need us all. It is a love poem in the way Juliana Spar means when she invokes art that has a crowd scene in it in which a crowd has been loved. It is a love poem, too, because it asks for so much, none of it for itself. It is not a good idea to tote a gun or a knife unless you are proficient in its use. All swords are two-edged, can be used against you by anyone who can get them away from you. Keats scholars, of course, will bend over backwards to tell you that To Autumn is about Peterloo and, by tortuous extension, the revolution. This is partly in response to the devastating criticisms of someone like Jerome McGann, who states bluntly that the whole point of a poem like this one is to dissolve social and political conflicts in the mediations of art and beauty. It is also a response to how much Keats scholars love Keats and how much it bothers them to see Shelley, the Oxford-educated son of a baronet, get the edge over their sort of working-class hero. In an ultimately unpersuasive counterattack, Tom Paulin scans To Autumn for evidence of radical sympathies. The poem's poppies are really redcoat soldiers, its crickets a figure for members of the radical underground preparing to winter out in readiness for the spring. It may seem controversial, Paulin writes, but Keats, in addition to being a top-notch shill for art and beauty, was also capable of writing coded political poems. It's not his fault that we have trouble seeing it. This claim doesn't seem especially controversial to me, nor does it seem true. When Keats wanted to write in a way that was obviously political, he did. See Isabella with what one contemporary critic called its schoolboy vituperation of trade and traders, and Shaw its Marxism avant la lettre. What he excelled at was a poetics of negation that insistently vaporizes any endorsement of the way things are. His work is not coded because a code is a riddle, and like all riddles, it is meant to be solved. A negation, an annulment of the possibility of forgiving anything about the reality we are forced to endure, is meant to linger and deepen. There is no solution to it. It is not a conundrum, but the signature of a crisis. Its job is to make crisis available, if only partially, to sensation and thought. On first pass, though, To Autumn seems far from negative. It seems, on the contrary, full of celebration, abundance, gravidity, life. The watchword of the first stout stanza is fruit, which appears 3 times in 11 lines, as though wherever the poem turns, it sees more of the same delicious thing. Nothing here is not tumescent, and even if we wanted to roll out some blank truism about ripeness being the overture to rot, we would still have to admit that, as it stands, Keats begins by obliging us to experience a totally real fullness. Unlike Ode to Melancholy, which waxes proverbial about how near growth lies to decay, To Autumn begins by locking us into a scene of present tense gratification. And unlike Ode to Psyche, whose susurrating finale makes the noise of things as they disappear, the sibilance of this stanza, from mists to selves, is intrusively loud. It fills our ears and hijacks our awareness so that we too are overbrimmed, knowing for a few moments nothing but this language and its great impenitent grace. The concept of natural beauty rubs on a wound. That's Theodor Adorno, who associates this wound with the violence that the artwork inflicts on nature by presuming it wants to represent and replace it. In To Autumn, the insult to natural beauty, in To Autumn, the insult is natural beauty itself, how it persists undeniably in a world of extreme and naked horror. If you wanted to push it, you could say that this thought is available to Keats only after Peterloo, as if, in the wake of that bloodbath, the mere fact of beauty becomes distasteful. Adorno says something similar elsewhere. Even the blossoming tree lies the moment its bloom is seen without the shadow of terror. Even the innocent, how lovely, becomes an excuse for an existence outrageously unlovely. If this poem agreed, it would be more like Ode on a Grecian Urn, which recoils even as it admits to deriving pleasure from art whose prerequisite is human suffering. But To Autumn has even less of what, if we weren't talking about poetry, we might call an argument. For all its virtuosic show of ease, the ode is poised on a very short brink. This lends it a distinctly white-knuckled quality, which you might not notice unless you asked why this poem needs to be so good, what emergency is needling it behind the scenes, and what hyperbolic effort has been put in place to keep it, the emergency, there. In this ode, perfection is not an achievement but a style, and it is essential to what Keats is trying to say. The problem with beauty is not that it is so fragile, but that it is so durable. It is there and true even in an avalanche of shit and despair. To acknowledge that fully, as this poem does, is a profound act of self-mortification. Every impeccable turn of every line is bought by shame, which can never be allowed to leach through the language it has hounded into being, lest it accidentally impersonate an alibi or a justification. That we can be here on this planet in this time, confined by these exact habits of survival, and still find things to call beautiful and to love, or to be unable to stop loving, is indefensible. But we are here, and we do. To Autumn confesses it for us. It is possible, even on the East Coast, to find an isolated place for target practice. Success will depend mostly on your state of mind. Meditate, pray, make love, be prepared at any time to die. If you wanted to make To Autumn a poem about Peterloo, you might pay special attention to that word, conspiring. It means exactly what you think it means. It names the same seditious relation as the phrase Cato Street conspiracy, which is what the press called a plan hatched on February 22nd, 1820, to kill the prime minister and all the members of his cabinet. Like Keats's Ode, the Cato Street conspiracy is formed in the aftermath of Peterloo. It happens in the resting phase of the revolutionary event, in its lull or breather, and that too is what conspiring means, breathing together. How lovely and doomed, writes Spar, this connection of everyone with lungs. 5 of the conspirators were transported to Australia, and 5 were hung at Newgate Prison. 2 had testified against the others, and they went free. The 5 that were hung, Arthur Thistlewood, Richard Kidd, James Ings, William Davidson, and John Brunt, were decapitated post-mortem. A contemporary account describes the scene. From the manner in which the last part of the execution was performed, very little blood was seen on the scaffold. The bodies being placed in a sitting attitude in their coffins, the blood could not flow copiously from them at the moment their heads were taken off. It was not till they were laid in a horizontal position that the vital stream could escape freely from the heart. The conspirators were executed in May in the brisk English spring. Their conspiracy is not to autumn, and their blood is not its last oozings. But they belong to the same long, muddy season where a break in the action allows at once for slackening and stealth, for the variously reluctant and rejuvenating encounter with beauty and the passionate confidences of treason. The second stanza of To Autumn is about death. From the almost comical profusion of the first 11 lines, we move on to a heavily, almost laboriously symbolic tableau of mortality. Keats gives us winnowing, he gives us half-reaped and reaping's instrument, the scythe or hook. He gives us the poppy, more opiate than redcoat, and in the cider press and the look of patience cast upon it, the hologram of a torture device, since to be patient, after all, is not just to wait, but to suffer. If the downtime of insurrection is sometimes quiet, and this stanza is furiously lulled or drowsed, it is nonetheless replete with effort, much of it painful. Some survive and some don't. Some are cut down and others spared. This whole stanza is built around an image of old-fashioned agricultural labor, but there is something massive and relentless about it, and something mechanical too. As the pristine iambs of the first 5 lines flow to a grind over drowsed and spared, while the staccato taps of steady shiver and jerk, the artwork is at risk of becoming an appliance. If autumn is not a machine, it has the indifference of one, sitting careless, unconcerned by the microscopic drama of who lives and who dies, who manages to accept somehow our terrible confluence of good and evil, and who simply can't, not because such a person is weak or intemperate, but because this is the math of half reaping. Roughly 50% won't survive, whatever survival means. It's to autumn that Keats speaks the reassuring phrase, think not of them thou hast thy music too, but what if it weren't? Or rather, what if he meant to address not the season, but the way of life for which it stands, the interim between riot and revolution we might be tempted to call with our enemies the time of our defeat. There is a way to read the ode as a celebration of passivity, and autumn changes dress from the first to second stanza, goes from being the architect of abundance, loading, blessing, bending, filling, swelling, plumping, budding, to a sleepy, even drugged out figure of resignation. This autumn stands, or dozes, at a good distance from what Keats calls its music, which by the third stanza has been outsourced to birds, lambs, bugs. Autumn's music, in other words, is less in autumn than around it. That music also echoes the fatalism of the poem's velvet middle. The mourning of the gnats is linked to the arbitrary movement of the wind, which buffets their tiny bodies as it lives or dies. These gnats, too, are half-reaped, as powerless to choose whether to live or die, fly or fall, as the robin is to refuse to whistle or the cricket to rasp its wings. The gambit of Shelley's Mask of Anarchy is that passivity is the best form of resistance. It is so potent that it doesn't even need human beings, just their blood. Slaughter talk, eloquent, oracular. To write that poem, Shelley relied on newspaper accounts of Peterloo, and mainly on those published in the Examiner, the weekly run by his and Keats's friend Leigh Hunt. The Examiner is often referred to as a radical publication, but that's not quite true. By the late 18 teens, it had nestled into a cozy centrism that would later prompt William Hazlitt to write that political is like military warfare. There are but 2 sides, and after you have chosen your party, it will not do to stand in the midway and say you like neither. And so it is not surprising that the examiner leaned heavily on the report of a sympathetic Manchester gentleman to insist on the total vulnerability of the Peterloo crowd and its non-aggression even when under attack. As this anonymous witness put it, the yeomen had literally to cut and hack a road across the field, and this they did through a people absolutely passive. No resistance of any kind was, or indeed could be offered. Reports that stones were thrown, etc., are, he hastened to add, altogether false. The Mask of Anarchy approves, and so does Shelley, whose commitment to nonviolence is arguably the most significant political feature of his work. Remember what Hope says, what they like, that let them do. But that is not the whole story of Peterloo, which in no way proves that nonviolence has a moral monopoly on resistance. Here's more from Bamford's passages. A heroine, a young married woman of our party, with her face all bloody, her hair streaming about her, her bonnet hanging by the string, and her apron weighted with stones, kept her assailant at bay until she fell backwards and was near being taken. But she got away covered with severe bruises. It was near this place and about this time that one of the yeomanry was dangerously wounded and unhorsed by a blow from the fragment of a brick, and it was supposed to have been flung by this woman. Bamford's memoirs weren't published for another 25 years, but after Peterloo, it quickly emerged that several members of the yeomanry and other security personnel were hit, and hit hard, with sticks and stones by what one protester, a man named William Buckley, called a people determined to resist. One had his ear halfway cut off by a brickbat. To dismiss these reports, as historians often have, by painting Peterloo's victims as helpless or placid, is an understandable but misguided impulse. Whatever compelling ethical claims exist for nonviolence, it has never been the only response to state terror. If we pretend that it is, then those who choose to resist differently, like Bamford's young heroine, appear disposable, the harm that comes to them justified. With all due respect to Shelley, it's hard to read The Mask of Anarchy and not conclude that the only good dissident is a dead one. But don't get uptight. The guns will not win this one. They are an incidental part of the action, which we better damn well be good at. What will win is mantras, the sustenance we give each other, the energy we plug into, the fact that we touch, share food, the Buddha nature of everyone, friend or foe, like a million earthworms tunneling under this structure till it falls. Diane de Prima's revolutionary letter number 7 gives hope to Keats's ode. This doesn't let To Autumn off the hook, and besides, the poem wouldn't want that. What it wants is to show us the human incapacity for resisting beauty, to show us that it really is impossible sometimes not to love the world, even when it provides ample evidence that it should not be loved. Keats does his best to present this state of affairs in a way that is neutral and detached. He refuses to make excuses for the poem, to discharge its difficult energies in the vapid, hysterical idiom of complicity. Instead, he forces us to inhabit an excruciating contradiction. We are attached, despite everything, to this place that has been weaponized against us, where the earth ingests our oozings and its ambient noises muffle our screams. We are attached, too, to poems about this place, especially when they commute suffering to metaphor, a half-reaped furrow, a choir of ululating bugs. De Prima pulls up to this contradiction and calmly exterminates it. She begins with an appeal to those not necessarily in the know, to those perhaps more comfortable with odes than with Molotov cocktails, flamethrowers, bombs, whatever might be needed for what she calls the action. This is a euphemism, and it is also not. Like conspiracy, the action does not rise to the high status of an event. It is anonymous, collective, and extempore, a name for a concrete but open-ended intensity to which some unidentified people are giving everything they have for an unspecified amount of time. Think about how we might use those words in everyday speech to describe a happening of whose nature and contours and content we are basically ignorant. I'm going where the action is, in search of an undisclosed excitement. The action is between phenomenon and wish. It is also a sort of code word, the part of the story where a bomb might drop, a rock might fly, an assassin get knocked off his horse, but you wouldn't want to say so out loud, not in certain company. Why the East Coast? Unlike California or the Midwest, The East Coast is densely populated, built up. This is the backdrop of Deprima's reassurance that even there it's possible to find a place to shoot a gun. But the East Coast, with its varicella rash of universities hugging the shoreline, is also a green zone of sophistication and prestige, the kind of place where someone might dutifully suggest that reports of stones thrown at Peterloo's precursory cops are suspect if they come from Tory sources. Success in such a context would mean not only finding a place for target practice, nor only the success of an ongoing struggle that occasionally and unpredictably coils into the action. It would also mean silencing a pedantic chorus of scruples, turning instead to the mind-emptying practices of meditation, prayer, sex, and provisioning for death. Keats would appreciate this spin on Buddha nature, which, as Deprima suggests, means compassion for all living things, but also a divestment from any beliefs or attitudes motivated by ego. In Deprima's poem, Buddha nature has the same inborn voluptuousness as negative capability. It is discovered in touch and in eating together, in shared knowledge and brusque encouragement. Here is how Deprima inches past Keats as far as loving the world goes. Whereas Keats makes us sit in the discomfort of our own receptivity to beauty, the beauty of nature and of his poem, Deprima reminds us that we have to live for something and then orders us to do it, and to do it with each other. His Ode to Autumn is a snapshot of one unacceptable aspect of an unacceptable existence. Her letter an imitation of its fall. Fall, or rather, falls is the last word of Deprima's poem, which promises that a consciousness freed from simple antagonism, friend and foe, gun and mantra, can turn impasse into action, loosening and ultimately leveling this structure of one thing versus another. But that's not all this structure is. This structure is this poem, and as long as it is not a gun, not sex, not a mantra, and not a million earthworms, it also has a bomb coming to it. Deprima's language is not Keats's, how could it be? But they are making the same promise. To hold so tight onto poetry, it surrenders its shape. To hold so tight onto us that we do too. Okay, thank you all for listening. I'm, as you can see, getting increasingly burnt by the sun out here. But I wanted, to give you a sense of how the book works and how the book was put together before opening up the conversation to hear your thoughts about it. One thing that I will say just really, really briefly, and that maybe we can touch on is, as you might perhaps have guessed, there's been a fair amount of, in some cases, resistance, and in some cases, just curiosity about the ways in which the book is interested in bringing the political economy of Karl Marx to, or rather Marx's critique of political economy, to bear upon Keats's poetry. And some people are really excited by that, and some people think that, it's a bit of a reach. To me, the justification is quite simple. If Keats hadn't died, and I say this in the book, if Keats hadn't died, Keats and Marx would have been contemporaries. So to me, it's not a particular it's not a particular outrage to suggest that these two thinkers might be read together, but it is something that people have drawn attention to and that seems to stand out about the book. And, the other thing is that I would sort of be interested to talk about, although I'm happy to be guided by you, the other thing I would be interested to talk about is the ways in which this book shifts the emphasis of literary criticism as it's currently practiced from sort of rigorous historical analysis to something a bit more free associative and perhaps even dreamlike in the way that this chapter works. So you'll see, or you heard just now, that I talk about things like Peterloo, or I talk about things like the Cato Street conspiracy, these very concrete historical events, but in a way that suggests an oblique rather than direct relationship between them and Keats's poetry. So that perhaps suggests a slight tweaking of the way that we maybe currently experience the practice of literary criticism. But as I try to adjust myself so that I'm not being blinded by the light, I will turn it over to you, and I would be really excited to hear your thoughts. So thank you for listening, and thank you for being here.
Well, Thank you very much, Anayat. And it's like you read out from the sections of the book, and I'm sure people are going to engage with your book, and as they go through reading Keats, and at the same time trying to see how, as you said, criticism that has a very heavily accented historiographical or anthropological source to it suddenly takes a different turn, where experimentation go. So in a way, you try to bring the things together, where the personal starts to, in a way, starts to talk about how the aesthetic of the book really works out. So it's very interesting. I mean, I do have a few things to discuss with you and ask you as well about your opinion, but I think there is a question somehow it popped up. I would just like to have a look at that. And Shumana Rai has a question. Shumana teaches at Ashoka University. Yeah.
Let's see. I can click on. Let me see. I click on the chat and then I see the question. Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you. Should I read this out loud? Can everyone see it? I will read what it says just in case people can't see it in the chat. This is energizing, this return to life lovingness and voluptuousness and the energy of negative capability that you are so beautifully importing to literary criticism. Thank you. Is this part of being experimental? Was thinking of John Clare as you spoke of this. John, their short height. Clare was 5 feet tall, his feeling small, his poverty and provinciality. Do you think that his height affected Keats's poems as well? So first of all, to me, yes, to take the first part of the question about what we think of when we talk about the experimental, historically, experimentation has been associated with ugliness, right? When we tell someone, oh, I don't know if you'll like that movie, it's quite avant-garde, or it's quite experimental, we're often saying there is something about this art object that pushes you away, that may even repulse you. And beauty has always been thought of in terms of conventionality, regularity, perhaps even a social order. And so one of the things that's interesting, I think, about this moment in the history of literary criticism is that an interest in beauty or an investment in beauty now seems to us so unlike the mainstream of literary critical practice that it's actually become experimental again. So I'm really fascinated by that. And so yes, to me, thinking about beauty and embodiment and sensuality is a form of experimentation for me in my writing. Absolutely. I am kind of obsessed with John Clare. I love teaching John Clare. In the book that Ranjan mentioned at the beginning in his introduction, The Calamity Form, there's a fleeting discussion of Clare in comparison to Wordsworth. And I unfortunately find that whenever I talk about Clare, I'm always doing it in a way that offers him as a point of comparison to another poet. So, here's what he does that Wordsworth doesn't do. Now I'll tell you more about Wordsworth. Here's what he does that Keats doesn't do. And now I'll tell you more about Keats. I haven't ever been able to devote a concerted amount of time to Clare, though I wish that I could, because I think he's such a fascinating poet. What's interesting about what you say, and this actually goes to the first part of your question as well, is that the experimental drive in Clare's poetry, I do think of Clare's poetry as intensely experimental. The experimental drive in Clare's poetry leans rather toward austerity. So even though the poetry is incredibly precise in its descriptions, I mean, unbelievably precise. Clare is very, very interested in adverbs and demonstratives. So a lot of times in his poetry, as you know, you'll get, that tree over there with the long top branch, right? So it's incredibly, incredibly specific kinds of loco description that work to really situate the reader in a concrete space, in a concrete time, in a concrete environment. They nonetheless, in terms of their language, in terms of their sound, have this spareness to them that and part of that is Claire's decision to write in dialect. You know, he doesn't use the same intensely overwrought and Latinate phraseology that Keats uses. But in a way, they are mirror images of each other. You know, Keats with his voluptuousness and his excess, which at the time did strike people as being experimental because it was quite unlike what anybody else was doing. The same thing goes for Claire. Even though Claire is often grouped with the peasant poets that I mentioned earlier, his poetry is quite different from theirs, quite distinct from theirs. There's a famous letter, Keats and Claire had the same publisher. There is a famous letter that John Clare sends to Taylor and Hesse, also Keats' publishers, kind of making fun of Londoners for mistaking the cry or the song of a regular old wren for the song of a nightingale. And this is sort of very clearly a dig at Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, you know, because Keats was a Londoner. He was a city boy, and Clare was absolutely not. He was a country boy. So there is I think very much a sense in Clare that Keats is not necessarily his competitor, but almost his sort of secret sharer or something like that. I mean, Clare was obsessed with Byron and wrote, especially later in life, wrote these sort of imitations of Byron, wrote his own version of Don Juan, which is quite obscene. But I do think that there is this very, very interesting connection between these two poets, absolutely. And I don't know about the height. Marjorie Levinson has this wonderful book called Keats's Life of Allegory. It came out decades ago. It was a very influential book for me. And she does talk quite a bit about Keats's height and Keats's sort of embodiment and how that influences his poetry. But yeah, I could go on, but thank you for that question.
But Anna, that was just taking a cue from Shumana's question. Do you really think that Keats was a provincial in spite of being a Londoner? The way he was actually looked at as an outsider within the kind of writing that the others did, and given kind of the background that Keats had, and also that, as you mentioned in your book, about being made fun of, especially since her mother left Keats and came back as an alcoholic, as you mentioned, and the kind of overabundance, whether it's alcoholism for Keats's mother or whether overabundance about Keats's sensuousness. I mean, all the actually started to build a kind of outsiderhood or outsiderness to Keats's locationality within the kind of elite London writing. So would that be a kind of would it be right? Probably, I'm just asking your opinion on that. Would it be probably right to say that Keats, in spite of being a Londoner, was also provincial in some way? Or do you think provinciality is just not about a geographic site? Provinciality is also something about the aesthetic that one espouses.
Yeah, I think, yes, I think that it's fair to use the term provincial to describe Keats's poetry as it was received, especially in the mainstream London periodical press. Maybe rather than provincial, if we wanted to have a slightly more concrete metaphor, we could just call it suburban. Because the thing about Keats is that he's not an absolute London insider. He was raised on the outskirts of London, and so his poetry is sometimes described as being more of a suburban poetry. The thing about Clare, to once again use Clare as my counterexample, is that Clare is provincial. He's literally provincial, but provincial in a way that is exotic. And that's the draw of the peasant poets in the Romantic period. You know, the reading public that is consuming books by people like Stephen Duck or Anne Yearsley or later John Clare, they think there's something sort of interesting and wild and exotic about these peasant poets who live in the boonies, what people in the US would call the boonies, meaning in the middle of nowhere as far as, city folk are concerned, and doing agricultural labor, other kinds of labor. Keats has a position that makes him seemingly uninteresting. Who wants to hear about the suburbs? Who wants to hear about the outskirts of London? Either you're in the city or you're firmly outside of the city. And so Keats has this in-between status. And that is primarily the thing that identifies him as an outsider, the fact that he's actually not quite outside enough. And all those accounts of him that I refer to in the introduction, that he was shabby genteel, a fanciful dreaming tea drinker, none of that's my language. That's all language that comes from reviews of Keats's poetry or attacks on the Cockney School of Poetry, this sort of loose affiliate group of poets that he was in. And they did not call themselves the Cockney School of Poetry. That was a term that was foisted upon them. You know, they were all accused of being too aspirational, too striving, wanting to be part of the mainstream, wanting to be part of the establishment, but simply not having the right class, you know, not being Shelley or Byron, not coming from the aristocracy. And so that is a different, even more problematic status in the Romantic era than being somebody like Clare and having, you know, no formal education whatsoever, as Clare did not. You know, Keats and his buddies like Leigh Hunt and William Hazlitt, they had much more of a formal education. Although Keats didn't attend university, he left school at around 16 to train as a doctor. So yeah, absolutely. And again, I hail Marjorie Levinson's book, which is very interested in thinking through Keats's suburbanness as an aesthetic, and particularly as an aesthetic that tries too hard, you know, that tries too hard to appear literate, that tries, or rather erudite, that tries too hard to show off its knowledge of Greek and Roman mythology. And that notion of Keats as trying too hard, being in excess, being somebody who overreaches, I think is certainly a very, very viable way to read poetry, 100%, yeah.
My last final two responses. I know it's getting late in India, and of course, it's the
I
sun.
know.
It's getting high on your head at this moment. So, yeah. So, two responses. I would very much love to know this. I'm very curious about it. One is that, as I see in your book, that you know, it reminds me that when I started to when we read, say, a T.S. Eliot, for that matter. And when we read T.S. Eliot's essay, say the tradition, individual talent, we hardly get a footnote. We don't get any footnote, we don't get any endnotes, but he's quoting from people. I find a similar kind of a thing in your book, and something where you are quoting, but even in double quotes, but you're not mentioning that in a footnote or an endnote. Do you think what could be the purpose, or what could be the intent for you to do that? I'm a little surprised by that, because whether the publisher really accepted it, or whether this contemporary academic discourse that all the time emphasizes on, say, any kind of a word that you use needs to be footnoted or endnoted. When such a kind of a trend is in place or in vogue, how is it that you manage doing that? What could be the intent for that? That's my first thing to ask you. And the second, because there is another question coming. The second one was that there is a kind of a wonderful correspondence that you build with three people here. One is Anahid, the second is Barthes, and the third is Keats. So all three are actually talking about a lover's discourse. And how do you intertwine the three people, and how do you develop your narration out of that? So two responses.
So I actually think there's a way to think about those questions together, and I'm grateful for the opportunity, because it allows me to talk a little bit about the prose style of the book, which is something that I want to say that I thought a lot about, although I wrote the book in a very, very short time frame, so I don't know how consciously I actually thought about it. But I'm actually a complete nerd, and I love academic writing, and I love very scholarly writing, and I love writing that has 5 million footnotes, and I love reading footnotes, and I love reading bibliographies. So I don't have this sort of knee-jerk distaste for that more technical academic writing that a lot of people do have, and that is sometimes, you know, dismissed out of hand as being alienating or jargonized. I actually am quite fond of that kind of work, because it suggests that literary studies, like, you know, theoretical physics, or like sociology, which you mentioned earlier, sociology and the anthropology, actually has a technical vocabulary of its own and has a methodology that is proper to it. It's not just, loosey-goosey and people talking about their feelings all the time, right? So I actually really like what we could call technical academic writing and have done it in the past. With this book, my relationship to Keats, who's somebody that I've written about in a more conventional way, my relationship to Keats is so deeply embodied and goes back to such a formative time in my own life, in my own childhood. Later in the introduction, I say that I started reading Keats when I was about 12, that it was easy for me to relinquish the apparatus of footnotes and the apparatus of bibliography and the apparatus of kind of hyper-citationality in order to enter into something that could be more narrative in the way that Roland Barthes' writing is quite narrative. So in Barthes' A Lover's Discourse, which is a template for this book, there is also a seamless quotation of thinkers like Freud or poets like Dante. And sometimes who it is that Barthes is quoting when he's quoting them, but you don't always know. Sometimes something will appear in quotations, but it won't be in proximity to a proper name. So you actually don't know where the line has come from. And if you're so inclined, you can look it up. What I do just on a purely pragmatic level in this book is anytime there is a quotation, it is in proximity to some proper name. So you can figure out who it is that I'm citing, because at the end of each chapter, there's an extensive biography of all the works that are mentioned in the foregoing discussion, the foregoing chapter. So I'm not trying to obfuscate anything, whereas I think Barthes often tries to obfuscate in a certain way. To me, it was important because the book is written for a general reader. Now, when we say general reader, there's a certain kind of person who's going to buy a book on Keats's Odes. One of the reader's reports that I had on this book said that I had to be careful using the word metaphor because most people don't know what metaphor means. And I thought, well, we don't know. I sort of thought, well, first of all, we don't, that many people don't know what metaphor means. We're in trouble. But, more to the point, anyone who's already picking up a book on Keats probably does know what a metaphor means. So I thought I was on sound footing there. But in designing the book for a general reader, I wanted to make literary critical discourse accessible and exciting in a way that I remember my first encounters with literary criticism being accessible and exciting. So I remember reading, Tradition and the Individual Talent, and as a freshman in college, maybe even younger, and loving that essay because it was so narrative, because it really was a kind of storytelling about an idea. And we don't really write criticism like that anymore within the academy. And I think that there could be more room for it. So, absolutely. And this goes back to what I said in response to the first question or the first comment. In a way, that kind of writing, which we think of as being very, very old school and very rigid. I mean, it doesn't get more conventional than T.S. Eliot, or more kind of conservative than T.S. Eliot. That way of writing, which we now think of as being quite conservative, actually seems quite avant-garde to us because people don't write like that anymore, So that's a play that I'm interested in. I saw, as long as I'm talking about the actual composition of the book. So I can say something about the book's color. At the end of each chapter, there is a section, I don't know if you can see this, but there's a section called sources. And then you see all the sources that were invoked within the writing. The color of the book is based on, or is an homage to, a book by the artist David Batchelor called Chromophobia. And that's a very, very short book about exactly what it sounds like, the fear of color in art. And when we were discussing designs for the book, I said, I want the book to be Chromophobia pink for all sorts of reasons. As you might have gathered, well, of course, pink is a very feminine color. It's a stereotypically feminine color and connotes frivolity, triviality. And I wanted the book to kind of do that. I wanted it to signal my own sense that it is a book partly about femininity. A lot of people have actually said that. It's not explicit in the writing, but a lot of people have responded to that aspect of the book or to my own experience of femininity. And I wanted it to flirt with being frivolous. I wanted it to flirt with being trivial, again, to signal the fact that it's not a traditional work of literary criticism. So And I really recommend David Batchelor's Chromophobia. It's an awesome book, and it's very, very short. You could read it in a couple hours. I'm going to read this quotation. Let's see, or this question. You read To Autumn Beautifully, the autumnal light on your face. Oh, that's very sweet. Thank you. The autumnal light on my face. As you read, almost adding another dimension to your literary criticism. Thank you. That's a very sweet thing to say. I'm trying to get some vitamin D. Vitamin D is supposed to keep us all healthy. A research student from our department writes to you, thank you for delivering such an energetic talk on Keats and that you cared to write another script to Keats's enormous life and work. Thank you. I could talk about Keats forever. I write about Keats in all of my books, and I think that his poetry is really endless. And there aren't so many poets that I would say that about, and I'm an English professor, so I should probably think that about everybody, but I don't. And I'm so grateful that people are interested and that people want to hear more about Keats and want to hear me talk about Keats. It's such a gift. So thank you. Let's see. Thank you for sharing the riveting passages with us. You talked about the sensuality of his poems. We know that he didn't think highly of his literary output. How would you think his awareness of the legacy he was leaving behind as a poet affected his work? So Keats actually did think highly of his literary output. Keats said very famously, I think I shall be among the English poets at my death. That was before he knew he was dying. And he says it was an incredibly cocky thing to say. He died when he was 25 years old. And when he said this, he was maybe 22 or 23, right? Like, I am sure that when I die, having now produced, and I think maybe he said that I don't know if he had even written the great Odes yet, but he had written, Endymion, which is a very famous, though I think not a very good poem. La Belle Dame sans Merci, which is a very, very famous poem. But he had this incredible confidence and bravado that went along with his anxiety and his sense of being, again, out of place. There's a letter in which he says, in comparing himself to Lord Byron, you see what it is to be under 6 foot and not a lord. Byron was famously quite tall by the standards of the time. And so he had a sense of himself as an outsider, as a stranger in a strange land to a certain degree, as somebody who, because of his traumatic childhood, would, as he said, never have a right feeling about women. But he was quite confident in his own poetic abilities. And one of the things that fascinates me about Keats and that I really admire about Keats, he worked extremely hard at being a poet. He had absolutely no desire. He suggests in one of his letters, he says, if poetry doesn't come as naturally as the leaves to the tree, it had better not come at all. Keats worked extremely hard at getting the leaves on his trees. He, wrote constantly and relentlessly and seemed to set himself particular tasks with each thing that he wrote. So with Endymion, it was, I'm going to write an epic poem. I'm going to write 2,000 lines and see if I can do that. When he was dying, he was writing a verse drama, a play. So the Odes, he refers to them as better, that's his word, better sonnets. I'm going to improve upon the 14-line form. So he actually is very, very confident in his poetic abilities. And I think that when you read the poetry over and you read his first poems and then you read something like the Great Odes, you see the development of that confidence to the point where he could compose something like To Autumn, which again is a famously perfect, just absolutely note perfect poem. So the mastery that he was able to develop in such an incredibly short space of time speaks, of course, to, if we believe in such a thing, a certain kind of inborn ability, but also just an incredible work ethic, incredible intensity in his relationship to writing.
Okay, that's what. We don't have any more questions for Anahid at this point. So I would like to thank Anahid immensely on behalf of the department, on behalf of all the viewers here and the participants, for actually taking time out and making this boy lecture series, giving a little dimension, a new dimension to this boy lecture. Say why? Because we have been having such different books on the forum. Like, for instance, the next speaker here on the 1st of December will be Kelly Oliver, and she will be talking about the carceral humanitarianism. So that's a very different kind of a book, which talks about the refugee problems and the border crisis and many different issues that come, obviously, in the kind of a perspective of the Epicurus of philosopher. But to really talk about Keats, to really talk about literary criticism, to talk about experimentation, to talk about something that really touches us from within, because there is nothing so ineffable and probably nothing so intangible and yet nothing so influential as a literary affect. So when you talk about Keats and when you talk about romanticism, there is something about this literary affect that starts to, in a way, circulate through our system. So this talk of yours, this book of yours, and this wonderful comment about the color of the book, because I was still wondering, I would ask you this, that why is this huge pink splashed on the cover? And that's the reason why we actually chose the flyer as well, to have
Yeah.
pink in the background with you in the center. So it's thank you, Anna, for wonderful session with us and such
Oh,
one
well, thank you.
actually shared with us, giving us a new direction to think and triggering us in different directions as well. So on behalf of all of us here, we thank you immensely, and we look forward to seeing you again with another book coming out, because this forum is all about talking about books. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.